This is Randall Smith, and you are listening to my lecture on the conceptual image, prepared for my Designer 2600 class, The History of Graphic Design, at the University of Utah, spring 2020. The lecture is based broadly on Chapter 21, The Conceptual Image, from the book Meggs, History of Graphic Design by Phillip, Meggs, and Alston, Purvis. After World War II, graphic designers began to place more emphasis on ideas and concepts instead of just simply narrative information. Mental content, that is, what it means or what you think about when you see it, together with the perceived content, that is, what it looks like, make up a conceptual image. Conceptual designers integrate the words and images. The total design is of more importance to them. Conceptual graphic artists also took opportunity to express themselves with more personal images and individual styles and techniques. Although the chapter titled Postmodern is still a lecture away, other graphic design historians would consider most of what we're discussing today postmodern. The term postmodern is at its heart just a chronological term, simply meaning after modern. In graphic design, modern refers to the international style, so postmodern design doesn't look like the international typographic style or the Swiss style, nor does it have the same conceptual basis. So you will see this chapter titled The Conceptual Image does not either. So it's really postmodern as well. We'll spend most of our time in the United States, but we're going to look at the creation of conceptual images in 4 different countries: Poland, the United States, Germany, and even Cuba. Start off with designers from Poland. There is a well-respected school of Polish poster art which emerged in Poland after World War II. Graphic design in Poland is accorded the status of more traditional disciplines like architecture or medicine. The poster has become a source of great national pride in Poland, and it has a unique cultural role there. At least traditionally, there was less broadcast media in Poland, therefore the poster was more important. Henryk Tomaszewski, a professor at the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts, has been an important influence for the Polish poster movement. Conceptual, that is, what it means or brings to mind, versus what it looks like, is apparent in this 1978 poster of Tomaszewski. It is in fact a poster referencing the 50th anniversary of puppeteers, and you can see that reference visually, and yet there are other more abstract, more conceptual components which really make you think. Tomaszewski pushed Polish graphic design to a very personal artistic expression in his work. This is a poster for a play, 1964, with collage and cut paper. Tomaszewski, as with many Polish posters, used photography and typesetting rather sparingly, preferring instead illustration and hand lettering. Tomaszewski trained a generation of graphic artists as professor of poster design at the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts. In fact, the students were not from Poland only. We'll mention a firm today, the partners in Grappus, a French design studio, who came to study with Tomaszewski. As early as the 1950s, the Polish poster began to receive international acclaim. Different stylistic tendencies developed in Polish poster art. This is the work of Jan Lenkia, who pushed the collage style that had been popular before him to a more powerful, maybe even threatening look. This is Lenkia some 12 years later, another menacing look to this kind of winged-looking being. This is 1976. And Jan Lenkia again, 7 additional years later. The Polish poster movement was not a coherent movement. It was just a very diverse group of painters and graphic designers, each seeking to establish their own artistic styles and identities. Two slides of another Polish designer, Waldemar Swerzy, demonstrating a kind of personal approach to his graphic design with these painterly solutions. It's said that he devotes 3 weeks to design a poster, often redoing it 5 or more times in the process. Here's Swerzy for a poster for Jimi Hendrix, his strokes capturing the vigorous energy of rock and roll. This is the work of Roman Ciesewicz, who worked a lot in collage, in this case superposing over the word CYRK. It's a circus poster, 1962. The work of Roman Ciesewicz includes a lot of collage, frequently using the half-tone dot enlarged to create textures. Although born and educated in Poland, Ciesewicz has lived and worked in Paris since the 1960s. This is a poster for a play in 1981. They have already occupied the next-door villa. Okay, moving to the United States. We've mentioned before the golden age of American illustration in the 40s and 50s, when traditional realistic style that was popular in America for half a century began to decline, doing so in the late 1950s. For many years, illustration was popular simply because it was easier to reproduce in printing than photography. And in fact, the death of illustration was predicted as photography took over the functions of descriptive images. But rather than dying, it seems like a new approach to illustration was emerging. And this more conceptual approach to illustration began in large part with a group of young artists headed by Nolan Glaser and Seymour Quast. We'll talk about both of them, but we're going to start with this guy, a self-portrait by Nolan Glaser of himself. There's a lot of diversity to the work of Nolan Glaser and Seymour Quast. We're starting off with Nolan Glaser. He was clearly making an alternative vision to the rigid ideas of the international style. He embraced lots of styles, in fact. Popular culture, fine art. He liked to embrace styles that to many were obsolete or passé, such as Victorian typography, and to cause people to look at them in a new light. In this early example of Nolan Glaser's work, we see his use of contour lines and flat-colored shapes. The figures are weightless shapes, just kind of flowing in a musical rhythm in this album jacket for The Sound of Harlem, 1964. This is an exhibition poster by Nolan Glaser, and this is a good example of the conceptual idea. This is for an exhibition entitled Big Nudes, and it's obvious that these nudes are so big that they don't even fit in the space allowed. Nolan Glaser is, in fact, one of the more well-known living graphic designers. He had a major exhibit at BYU, their Museum of Art, about 9 years ago. And I went to that. It was interesting to hear him speak in person. Over the years, Glaser has reinvented himself over and over again as a creative force by exploring new graphic techniques and motifs. Glaser has been widely imitated. I think only his steady stream of solutions and explorations keep him from being consumed by those who imitate his work. Another example of Nolan Glaser's conceptual approach to a poster for an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art on the subject of Dada and Surrealism, 1968. He's taking these words and instead of treating them just as abstract symbols or signs, he's turned them into tangible entities, giving them life as objects. It was, however, rejected by the Museum of Modern Art in 1968. I suspect that nearly everyone has seen this image, and maybe you knew who did it. It was, in fact, Nolan Glaser's most iconic image. There's an interesting story behind the commissioning of this poster. Bob Dylan had arrived in New York City in 1961 at the young age of 21, and in 5 years had produced 7 albums that were very successful. Dylan had become adopted by the generation of the time as the musical spokesman. In 1966, Bob Dylan was riding a motorcycle in Woodstock, New York, when the back wheel locked and Dylan went over the top of his motorcycle. Many thought, including myself, that he was dead, perhaps just a story to cover up on a drug overdose. But whatever happened, the music had died and Columbia Records was actually in a panic. To fill the gap, Columbia Records decided on their own to put out a greatest hits album. The Columbia Records art director was John Berg, and he had this dramatic photo of Dylan that he liked, and the photo had been rejected by Dylan as cover art previously, but because Dylan was under breach of contract with the record company, he no longer had control over what they could do. And it was further decided to include a free poster in each of this new greatest hits album. They had wanted to use the same photo that was on the cover, but they still needed someone to design the layout of the poster. John Berg thought of Nolan Glaser because he had seen some art of his with silhouettes, and the silhouette reminded him of this particular photograph. So when the request came through from John Berg to design the poster of Dylan using the photo, it didn't strike Nolan Glaser as anything particularly extraordinary. He had very little time to execute it, so he did what he was already doing. In addition to silhouettes, Glaser had been working with black ink contour lines. He used those lines to fill them with adhesive color films, almost a coloring book style. Glaser was intrigued by the psychedelic designs that were coming out of the West Coast, and he combined those influences together with his own hand-drawn typeface, and rather effortlessly and entirely intuitively, Glaser based this image on two different sources, a self-portrait by the Dada artist Marcel Duchamp and classical Persian miniature paintings. Glaser said he was intrigued by the contrast of the hard, reductive style of Dylan's profile with the expressive nature of the hair, very bright, whimsical, and colored. In his original design, and the only sketch that he had done, Glaser had included a harmonica, much like the photograph. But when John Berg, the art director, saw the sketch, he said, let's simplify it. And so Glaser removed the harmonica, creating just a white negative space nearly equal to the black silhouetted profile. This increased the visual vibration and design and brings more attention to the profile. It captures the essence of how people felt about Dylan and his music, and nearly 6 million copies of this poster were printed and distributed inside Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits album. It makes it one of the most seen and reproduced images ever. This, in fact, is my own copy of the poster from when I purchased it my purchase of the album back in high school. I've been a Bob Dylan fan, and I've kept it all these years, despite the fact that I remember being somewhat disappointed when I found that the free poster inside was not the photograph on the cover of the album. Nonetheless, I've got it hanging in my studio. It's not in greatest shape. You can see some fold lines indicating it's folding in the album jacket and some corners that haven't weathered very well, but I've kept it all that time anyway. Here's the pushpin style applied to an advertising poster. This is a pastiche of Italian Renaissance painting. It includes a dog, a sandaled pair of feet, belonging to whom we're not too sure, some of Glaser's own stencil lettering, and Olivetti's Valentine typewriter that we have seen just last week, an icon of industrial design. What's kind of interesting about this poster of Milton Glaser, it's really devoid of any kind of recognized logic. And yet it seems to be suggesting a narrative of some kind, but it's rather ambiguous. There's a surreal combination of a dog, a typewriter, and feet. Something's going on here, but what? I'm not too sure. Is the dog guarding the typewriter? What happened to that Roman gladiator? What time period is this? Do gladiators have typewriters? The story really belongs to the individual who created it, Glaser. He seemed to work without any systematic principles, just his imagination and skill. He liked Italian paintings, and he liked stencil lettering, and maybe he liked dogs too. Found them a way to bring them all together. This is the kind of personal expression and narrative definitely we did not see in the international style. This is a poster that Milton Glaser created for a Bach concert. The more complex image grew out of Glaser's interpretation of Bach's music. Quote, particularly in terms of the music's structure and geometry. The geometric references include an Islamic rug and perspectives. The leaves and trees were the more pastoral aspects of Bach's music. I discovered the work of Pushpin and Nolan Glaser and Seymour Quast while I was still deep in my Swiss education, but it made a big impression on me. I bought a book about Pushpin published by Communication Arts, but I was almost embarrassed by my attraction to it due to the very strict Swiss style that I was being educated in. I was afraid my professor, Roland Siegrist, who is from Basel, Switzerland, would catch me with the book or perhaps discover that I had designed the Daily Utah Chronicle masthead in avant-garde Gothic. All of this was in direct contrast to my Swiss-style education. In fact, Nolan Glaser said, quote, "There is no single voice capable of expressing every idea. Romance is still necessary. Ornament is still necessary. And simplification is not better than complexity." So you might ask yourself, do you feel you're more attracted to the modernist approach or the Nolan Glaser approach? Here's another example of Nolan Glaser's work for another Bach-related poster. Here he uses a variety of different drawing approaches, perhaps suggesting the diversity of Bach's music itself. This, I think, is a good example of Nolan Glaser's approach to a conceptual solution. And I ask you to pause and look at the illustration and try to think what, in fact, might be a conceptual idea that Glaser is trying to communicate here. I might add that Poppy is a small, very small, record company. This poster was created in 1968. And perhaps you've thought about the idea that Poppy Records, which you've probably not heard of, was an independent record company. And it's suggested here that they are symbolically breaking into the more established recording industry. Kind of literal interpretation of the band Lovin' Spoonful, together with Glaser's stencil lettering. Glaser often injected a little bit of humor or wit into his work, in contrast to the international style, which really represented the utmost in seriousness. Pushpin seemed to like silly visual puns and caricature drawings. Glaser felt that the modernist approach was cold and mechanistic. Glaser said, in direct reference to my education, modernism was a very powerful force on the theoretical side of design, in the schools and in intellectual publications, but we at Pushpin felt that there was another way to approach these things. We had other preferences. It seemed silly to have just a single source of ideas. We happened to like Victorian typography. Seymour was particularly interested in Romantic typography, and he also liked woodcuts and American primitives. We didn't believe in eating vegetarian food all the time. Sometimes you just want a greasy burger. The work, however, was not a revival, a Victorian revival, or any other sort. They made no determined commitment to use any one artistic period or another. They just simply chose to work with whatever caught their eye at the time. Glaser doesn't claim to be a very great draftsman and says it's a challenge for him to capture likenesses. This is a poster for Aretha Franklin for Columbia Records. Graphic design is more frequently divided between those who tend towards illustrative solutions versus designer solutions. Designer meaning image making and layout. But like the Art Nouveau artists, Mucha and Will Bradley, both Glaser and Quast united these components into some kind of a total effort. Poster for a motion picture called Zabriskie Point. This is 1972. It kind of provides a preview of this independent film's concluding sequence in which a large house is blown up and its contents are scattered into space. You should note that Pushpin style did not lend itself to big corporate programs, corporate identity programs for big companies, annual reports. They weren't getting $100,000 to do a corporate logo like Paul Rand did. Just did, quote, really funky little things, in the words of Glaser, for small-scale businesses and progressive organizations. You can't take intellectual risks on Glaser said you can take intellectual risks on book jackets, said Milton Glaser, but you can't do that with a corporate logo. Glaser did a few typeface designs. This is a sign that Milton Glaser found in Mexico, and it was the inspiration for one of his typefaces called Baby Teeth. The sign was for a tailor, and Glaser believed that the E was drawn as only someone unfamiliar with the alphabet would have even conceived. And so he developed from that sign a alphabet that was consistent. In fact, he used this on his very famous Dylan poster. The typeface was called Baby Teeth. Here's another typeface that Milton Glaser designed called Neo Futura. It's a stencil typeface and sometimes referred to as Glaser stencil. We've already seen it on 2 or 3 of the posters we've looked at, including the Olivetti Dog Gladiator poster. This is a call for entries for the New York Art Directors Club, created by Glaser in 1987. It's unusual just because it doesn't have illustrative content, which is Glaser's more typical approach. I saw Milton Glaser sitting alone during a break at the AIGA National Conference in Las Vegas about 10, 12 years ago. I walked up to him and I told him how intrigued I was about his comment regarding use of computers in his design studio. He had talked about computers in regards to what he called the fuzzy concept. He said the computer becomes, as soon as you have an idea, it becomes too clear. There's not enough fuzziness in computer solutions, so you have to figure it out too early, and what you get is a very well executed but ordinary idea, because there's no development in this kind of system. Interesting perspective that Glaser has on the use of computers, and this was 10 or 12 years ago. There's a great article in Looking Closer for the subsequent book to the one that we have for our textbook, in which Glaser talks about the ideas of the computer, and he says he decries the marketing departments whose only definition of good is that which yields profits. His article is titled Design and Business, the War is Over. Nolan Glaser poster for the School of Visual Arts. It's playing off the perceived versus conceptual icons of René Magritte, the surrealist artist. The visual and verbal meanings are explained by manifesting a hat as a photograph, a shadow, a word, a pictograph, and a written definition. Milton Glaser's work for the city of New York has been copied relentlessly all over the world. It was designed for free by Glaser, which had come to him actually while riding in a New York taxicab. It almost seems as though it wasn't designed at all. It was so obvious, so simple, just kind of inevitable. But of course, someone has to think about the combination of type and image stacked, etc., in order to come up with a solution like this. The logo was needed to shore up New York City's reputation as a tourist destination in the mid-'70s, when many associated with the city with crime and urban decay instead of tourism. Never before had graphic design been used to rebrand a New York City's image. The smaller image is the 1975 original. After the bombing of the World Trade Center, the New Yorker magazine asked Glaser to provide a visual for the cover, and his cover solution was to revise his original mark in 2001. Glaser was commissioned by the Mostly Mozart Festival to create a poster for New York's Lincoln Center. It shows Wolfgang Mozart walking along a streetscape, stopping at one point to sneeze, perhaps poking fun at the stuffy notions of classical music. I had the opportunity to spend a couple days with Milton Glaser when he was in Salt Lake City, but it was about 30 years ago. I was president of the local chapter, the AIGA. He spoke here on the University of Utah campus, and he also donated a bunch of his posters to the organization, who then sold them to help fund the organization. So I have a signed copy of this particular poster hanging up in my office at home. Besides posters, Glaser does a lot of editorial design, but even more unusual, in recent years, he's branched out into restaurant and store environments. Glaser has a keen intellect. He's very articulate, unlike some who are only able to communicate visually. Glaser's not that way. He's very articulate in writing and speaking. He spent many months exploring the effects of supermarket aisles on grocery buying decisions, signage and lighting in stores and restaurants. He spoke at the AIGA International Conference in Washington, D.C. in 2001, where he criticized designers for following trends like always dressing in black. In 2009, Glaser was the first graphic designer to receive the National Medal of the Arts award presented to him by Barack Obama. At least from a graphic design point of view, Glaser is one of our national treasures. Quote, design is an activity that has social meaning, more beneficial than design as a selling tool. I hope that that's my legacy, said Glaser. He's now 88 years old, still designing, still working in his office daily. I recently read that Glaser said retirement is one of the problems with society today. This is a 1984 portrait of Seymour Quast, Glaser's partner at Pushpin Studio. Quast was stylistically quite different from Glaser, perhaps even more personal than his business partner. In 1953, Glaser and Quast, together with two other classmates from Cooper Union, decided to publish a self-promotional piece that they called the Pushpin Almanac. This promotional publication became the foundation of their business and their early success. They really had no idea that their little freelance collaborative would not only lead to the founding of Pushpin Studios, but also emerging out of that studio a graphic style that would really challenge the prevailing method of functionalism that had been imported from Europe and the Bauhaus. A taste for things old-fashioned was returning, Victorian typography and ornament, apparently as a reaction to what was perceived as cold, humorless modernism. They changed the name first to the Pushpin Monthly Graphic, and then later on the Pushpin Graphic dropping the monthly part because they could never keep up with the publishing schedule. The editorial content was usually things picked up from books and periodicals. It brought them tons of work. This is an interview that Milton Glaser had regarding the publication, the Pushpin Graphic. Glaser said, "We had the great advantage of having this little publication we produced, at first the Pushpin Almanac, and then the Pushpin Graphic, that was, in retrospect, a tremendous device for getting us clients." The interviewer then asked, "How did you know who to send it to?" Glaser said, "We just sort of put together a list we would add to, found out who was in the Art Directors Club, we got a list of agencies. Basically, we were looking for art directors in agencies and art directors in publications. Eventually, we had several thousand names, and people were subscribing to it. It was a tremendous benefit to us. It really was the single thing that accounted, I think, for our early success, because it was constant. It came out every month or two, whereas everybody else would send out a promotion and then wouldn't send out anything for another year. The frequency of the Pushpin Graphic made a big difference." The interviewer then said, "It must have been hard to keep up." Glaser said, "It was, but we were younger then, and it was our life." Other commercial artists who advertised their services to the trade were doing it very straightforward and unimaginatively. The logo on mastheads was designed by Glaser in a variant of German Fraktur, came up with their own editorial content, but the editorial content did not comment on the field of graphic design like most publications of its type. This one, in fact, is on the subject of mothers, with a cover illustration by Quast of a mother who clearly loves her son, but seems to possess both angelic and hellish characteristics. Here's the editorial page of that same issue, rather decorative, a very traditional layout, with an article on 50 ways to leave your mother, a takeoff, I think, of the Paul Simon song. I recall trying to make some sense of the editorial content because we used to subscribe to this publication at the first place I worked back in the 70s. I specifically remember the chicken issue as opposed to this one, which was the mother's issue. When I was reading the chicken issue, I had got to about the third article when I realized that the words really weren't too important. The article seemed to have little consequence, made no serious points. Some made no sense at all. It was just an excuse for the illustrations and design. Pushpin was known for its humor at a time when the international style represented the utmost seriousness. Designers like Quast reveled in these silly visual puns and character drawings. This Mothers issue featured a series of full-page black-and-white illustrations of the mothers of famous artists. This is a portrait of the Cubist painter Juan Gris's mother by Seymour Quast, obviously painted in a Cubist style. And here we've got Edward Munch's mother screaming at her baby. And Nolan Glaser drew Aubrey Beardsley's mother. Beardsley, of course, is an artist we talked about in our first lecture. And finally, in a 2-page spread, we learn how little Jack Pollock got his inspiration for his drip-style paintings. Other Pushpin illustrators portrayed Toulouse-Lautrec's mother, Paul Gauguin's mother, etc. Each issue of the magazine had a handful of industry-related ads, which were clearly designed by the Pushpin artist in exchange for services. This is an ad for a typesetter who delivered type right to your door. Of course, typesetting is an industry that doesn't even exist anymore. Last year, I was on the Pushpin website and found that they sold issues of the Pushpin graphic. This Mother's issue is from 1976, but I ordered it for $28, shipping and handling included. And these scans were all made from my own personal copy of the Mother's issue. This is a subsequent issue, number 77, on the subject of machines, illustrated with their unique vision and styles that evoked the past, but on the subject of machines. Here's a poster Seymour Quast did for the City of New York, 1983. It's really a demonstration of this conceptual approach to design the writer's pen has turned into skyscrapers. Of course, New York City is associated with skyscrapers. Often, Seymour Quast used this linear technique with adhesive color films to overlay flat color. I remember seeing a cover to Time magazine a few years ago that had a Quast illustration on the subject of Japanese technology that also used this same illustrative approach. Here's a moving announcement Quast did for Elektra Productions. This is 1965. Walking, riding, or propelled by some kind of locomotive power, the client's name just travels to its new location because, in fact, it was a moving announcement. The Vietnam War polarized the American public like no other war since the Civil War. And Seymour Quast did this illustration in 1968. The battles between the hawks and the doves, the left and the right, the young and the old, waged at that time period in media, pictures, music. There were nightly views of Vietnam battlefields and inspired a lot of protest posters aimed at the leaders of the country. This is a multicolor woodcut portrait of Uncle Sam, but the bad breath of airplanes dropping bombs by using mass-market advertising slogans, combined with the symbol of American patriotism and the simple rendering of an air raid. Seymour Quast has used his skills as a graphic designer to make a political statement. He understood that this wasn't going to change any minds, but was the best means for Quast to express his own growing frustrations. That was not his first anti-war poster, however. In '64, just prior to the first buildup of the troops in Vietnam, he created this one. War is good business, invest your sons. Quast said he saw a saying on a small button, and he liked the saying and turned it into this poster. Seems like there's still relevance to this saying even today. Quast really loves Victorian typography. This is kind of in the style of a 19th century woodcut poster, but it's got lots of bright colors. Few people other than Quast would be inclined to draw a catalog of separate styles on the single subject of a nose, but he did this for a Japanese magazine called Idea in 1976. The piece is called A Manifesto on Electricism. Quast designed the first package as a Christmas gift for the clients of Pushpin Studio in 1974. This gift was well received, and Pushpin decided to design an entire line and market them. Seymour Quast poster announcing a canal motorcycle event. Poster for Masterpiece Theater. Fashion and graphic design share at least one thing in common. They're both ephemeral art forms. Both create things that are short-lived. But like fashion, graphic design trends are periodically rediscovered. Nostalgic fads are seen interesting and new to each generation. Pushpin definitely influenced an interest in nostalgia in the 70s. Quast's poster for a TV show featuring the magician Doug Henning shows how much fun nostalgia can be. Nostalgia is one of those ideas that keep showing up again and again in graphic design. In a moment, we'll be talking about the psychedelic poster designers who are revisiting Art Nouveau era. We don't have to go that far back for nostalgic feelings. The 2011 short film Pixels leans heavily on nostalgia of video games from the 80s. 8-bit creatures are out to destroy New York City by rasterizing everything in their path. This is from 2015. This is an announcement for an anti-nuke rally, June 12, 1982, designed by Seymour Quast. The group had asked him to do a positive image of peace rather than a negative image of war, which is generally easier to do. So Quast used the dove peace symbol with different legs to suggest the notion that marchers will come from different walks of life. After you've seen a few of Quast's illustrations, you begin to recognize his work or someone who's copying it. Just like Glaser, Quast designed a number of display typefaces: Victorian, Art Nouveau, Op Art, Art Deco forms. Quast and Glaser eventually dissolved their partnership in 1975, but the Pushpin group continues with Quast as its head. This is a piece that Quast designed for Mohawk Paper Mills in 1988. Interestingly, Seymour Quast is married to Paula Scheer. In fact, the Mother's issue lists Paula as a co-editor along with Seymour. When Paula was in town 10 years ago, I asked her about her marriage to Seymour Quast when we were having dinner over at Squatters. She promptly told me that she had married Seymour not once, but twice. Both had had unsuccessful relationships in between who were not designers. she decided that marriage to a designer was the best. Her pre-speaking dinner was cut short when she jumped in a car to go see the Salt Lake Public Library signage, which had been designed by one of her pentagram partners. A number of other designers and illustrators who worked at Pushpin have moved on to other positions and have become well-known in their own right. We're just going to look at one or two sides of each of four different individuals. Reynold Ruffins is one of those individuals who was associated with Pushpin. He has very decorative color work and abstracted forms. Another individual associated with Pushpin was Barry Zaid. This is a cover for the Australian edition of Vogue magazine in 1971. Zaid was influential in the revival of Art Deco and other geometric forms of the 20s. This is an illustration of Barry Zaid's from the Pushpin graphic. He obviously used other graphic vernacular besides the Art Deco, because this is in fact very Art Nouveau. James McMullen was another illustrator that worked at Pushpin. He was instrumental in reviving the watercolor medium that had lost its popularity. You can see in this particular image here both his photograph that was used for reference purposes, a intermediate sketch, and the finished illustration. McMullen, like others in the conceptual approach to design, was very interested in the total design, including lettering as part of the total image. And yet another Pushpin alumnus. This is the work of Paul Davis, whose painting style was very meticulous, naturalistic, with lots of minute detail. And like McMullen, Davis often integrated the image and the words into a single painterly design. Paul Davis now heads his own firm. Richard Hess was a graphic designer who I heard tell a story once about how he ended up becoming more of an illustrator. He said that he had engaged an illustrator for an annual report project, but was unable to find the illustrator when, in fact, it was due, and he decided he had to do the job himself. And lacking any materials and late at night to purchase anything, he unhinged one of his kitchen cabinet doors and painted his illustration on the inside of the door, thus beginning an illustration career. Richard Hess was not associated with Pushpin, although his rendering style is kind of similar to Paul Davis. This is an album cover for Charles Ives, the 100th anniversary. This was in 1974. Charles Hess was the illustrator. Henrietta Conduct was the art director at the record label. This is a very typical Victorian approach, a lot of complex images and frames from the composer's time period. I distinctly recall when this illustration on this album cover became widely published in 1974, and it influenced a lot of other designers as well. Richard Hess has a tendency towards surrealism, kind of influenced by Magritte, I suspect. This is an illustration done together with his son, Mark Hess, who had first worked together with his dad on the very same paintings, but later began his own career. We've mentioned before the relationship between music and design. I think it's interesting how the same words are often used to describe both mediums. Words like rhythm, texture, tone, color, resonance. The art directors and designers working in the music industry are immersed in that relationship. And as with others in this chapter, they often turn to conceptual solutions, like this album jacket for the William Tell Overture. According to legend, Tell successfully shoots an apple off of his own son's head. So this is a good example of how the art director becomes a co-creator with the photographer or the illustrator to execute a concept. Columbia Records has had a long association with good quality design, beginning with John Berg, who was the art director for this particular album in 1963. It was, in fact, John Berg who did Dylan's Greatest Hits album that we talked about earlier. Here's some more work as director at Columbia Records by John Berg. This is an unusual portrait of the Byrds. This is the 1975 cover art for Born to Run, one of rock music's most popular and iconic images of Bruce Springsteen. The photo is by Eric Miola, which the art director John Berg ran onto the back of the fold-out cover. This very thin lettering graced the mass-produced version, an unusual touch then. And this particular album design has become kind of a classic. There has been, in fact, parodies of this album design published on social media. Almost a corporate identity-like approach to a series of albums by the band Chicago have all been art directed by John Berg. They all feature the Chicago logotype in different means and different ways. Here on a chocolate bar. This is 1976. The band's manager never wanted to show the band members on the album covers. In an interview, John Berg said, "The Chicago logo, I think the first band logo per se, was fashioned for me by Nick Fasciano from my initial sketch." John Berg said, "If you look carefully, the logo, whether rendered in leather or chocolate, in the form of a map or a banknote, is always in exactly the same size and the same position on the cover." Glaser and Quast were perhaps the reason why Columbia Records is known for their design is because that's where it all started. Columbia was the first company to design original cover art beginning in the late 30s. Alex Steinmus really invented the physical LP record sleeve for Columbia. The record company noted that albums with custom art sold much better than those without. This is a nicely designed album illustrated by Steinmus in 1948 for a classical music collection. He said, "I tried to get into the subject, either through the music or through the life and times of the artist or composer." But by the 50s, with the advent of Swiss modernism and the use of photography, Steinmuss's illustrative covers looked kind of dated. Of course, it was much younger designers during the rock and roll era that emerged as the most innovative designs. It was, in fact, Elvis Presley's debut album in 1956 that was ranked number 40 in Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest album covers. Interestingly, no one even knows who designed it. Even the name of the photographer was debated. But it spent 10 weeks at number 1 in 1956, and the first rock and roll album ever to make it to the top of the charts, and the first million-selling album of the genre. Elvis's album design apparently resonated with others. This is the band London Calling, the third studio album by the British punk rock band The Clash in 1979. The album received unanimously positive reviews and was ranked at number 8 on the Rolling Stones list of the 500 greatest albums of all time in 2003. Despite the fact that the photographer didn't want to use this particular photo, the designer did, and it has since been hailed as capturing the ultimate rock and roll moment. Of course, for someone my age who grew up with these 12 by 12 album jackets, almost mini posters in and of themselves, the loss of the album cover in the digital era has been a really sad development for me and others my age. The music and design of the album were two closely related experiences. I would indulge in the album jacket and the lyrics, the credit information, just as intimately as I would the music itself. I learned the names of famous designers and photographers that way. And I own and still play every album I ever purchased, and even some that I didn't purchase. I am encouraged that vinyl is making a comeback. I read that it's up substantially from just last year. So perhaps the album cover isn't dead. This is The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, 1972, the second greatest album of all time, 45 million sold, right behind Michael Jackson's Thriller. The design was by Hipgnosis, Hipgnosis, a London design group whose work really defined 1970s conceptual music. One of the Rolling Stones' most notorious jacket designs was 1971's Sticky Fingers, conceived and directed by Andy Warhol, but designed and photographed by others. The original vinyl release had an actual functioning zipper. Many fans assumed the tight jeans photo was of Mick Jagger, but those actually involved in the project said that Warhol had many of his factory associates shot. A number of people laid claim to the photo. After shipping, retailers discovered the zipper was causing damage to adjacent records. They sent them back, where hundreds of women carefully repositioned the zipper in the center of the record, where damage would only affect the label, not the vinyl grooves. Record albums are a nice segue into the late 60s in San Francisco. It's where hippies reigned and hallucinogenic drugs flowed and rock music filled the air. The social upheavals in America during the 60s spawned a design mannerism that were as much statements about social viewpoints as they were advertising commercial messages. It was called Psychedelia. The first posters emerged from the Haight-Ashbury counterculture of San Francisco and refers to the rejection of mores and social norms in the 60s. Psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD, played a big role in the formation of the counterculture. Artists and designers adopted a look of a psychedelic trip to appeal to the target audience. The designers were largely self-taught. The artist's primary clients were rock and roll promoters. Wes Wilson was the original innovator of the style and did this, The Birds at Fillmore, 1967. Here's another Wes Wilson poster for the Grateful Dead and others in 1966. You can see this hand-drawn line art printed in these very intensely vibrating colors. Interestingly, a few years ago, I was looking at some photographs of me and my siblings at my parents' home, and on the photo of one of my brothers in the bedroom that we shared together while in college, I saw this very poster hanging on the wall behind him. So, living through the decade myself, I can personally attest that the posters were on the wall more often than they were on the streets. Many posters, the message was deciphered rather than read, which seemingly contradicts its own reason for existing. Why make a poster if resulting text and image are so illegible as to be unreadable? The psychedelic poster movement manifested another aspect of modernism, the embrace of historist styles. Designers borrowed indiscriminately from past styles without adopting the ideology or the principles of any given historical movement. Aubrey Beardsley, the 19th century illustrator who was full of sexual fantasies, was an influence, as was Alphonse Mucha, the Art Nouveau designer. And they mixed together historical references that did not necessarily fit with one another. This is Wes Wilson for the Association, 1966. This is Victor Moscasco, poster for Blue Cheer, 1967. Again, more of these vibrating color palettes, vintage photographs. The only major artist of the movement was Victor Moscasco. He had some formal art training. He went to the Cooper Union, where both Glaser and Quast had attended. This is another of Victor Moscasco for Junior Wells, 1966. We actually mentioned this photo when we were talking about Art Nouveau. The style highly influenced by the flowing forms and the typographic styles of Art Nouveau, particularly the Vienna Secession. Here, in fact, is that 1902 Vienna Secession poster that we compared to psychedelic era posters. So this is 1902. Here's Victor Moscasco again for the Chamber Brothers, 1967, using the bright colors often associated with the op art movement, combining that with images of popular culture and that Vienna Secession lettering inside of the sunglasses. Each of the principal artists had a distinct personal style, and yet the overall visual language was similar between them. Images like this that are in the public domain were often co-opted, but of course the originals weren't in these bright colors. This is Victor Moscasco again, poster for Miller Blues Band, 1967. Originally, these posters were only communicating to a select community, excluding others for a brief period of time, but eventually co-opted by the mainstream and exposed throughout the world. There was a brief but well-defined artistic movement, and it's not hard to recognize the style. Much of it unfairly lumped under the umbrella of 1960s kitsch, but like that of great turn-of-the-century poster designers like Charest and Bernhard, the original psychedelic work transcends its stylistic era. This is Stanley Mouse for the Grateful Dead, 1966. And speaking of the Grateful Dead, I've kept a poster from my college years where the Grateful Dead were appearing right here at the University of Utah Union Ballroom. In fact, this poster hangs alongside my Glaser Dylan poster in my studio. I saw this very poster on sale for $2,000. Mine is not in the best of condition, but nonetheless it indicates the popularity and the price paid by some collectors. Most of the artists in the style were from San Francisco, but some aspects of the psychedelic poster were evident in the popular art of others, including the New York designer Peter Max. He was, in fact, in Park City a few years ago for an exhibition of his work. Peter Max combined the Art Nouveau qualities of the psychedelic poster with a little more inviting image and perhaps less vibrant color. I remember a few years ago a client of mine mentioning Peter Max when he was looking at a design proposal of ours. Although I didn't see any relationship to Peter Max, but apparently my client did. Peter Max experimented with images and printing techniques, as in this lettering in the hat, printed with a split fountain. The poster was adapted from a book jacket designed by Peter Max for a Lautrec biography. Graphic designers have often reprised elements from the past as pastiche. Pastiche is a term used to describe an artistic work in a style that imitates that of another period. Designers use pastiche either to signal a particular period aesthetic or to make a point. Historical pastiche is useful in telegraphing specific codes that are used to manipulate your perception and trigger your response as a consumer. For instance, if you think about the following styles, you often think about their intended implications. For instance, Victorian often suggests historic. Russian constructivism often suggests revolutionary. The Bauhaus suggests progressive, Art Deco, elegant, psychedelic, drugs, 1950s atomics, goofy, and even 1980s hipster. David Lance Goins has made the pastiche of Art Nouveau his signature style for much of his work. This is a poster David Lance Goins did for a well-known Berkeley, California restaurant known as Chez Panisse, 1973. David Lance Goins is an interesting individual in graphic design history and kind of untypical of our times when we tend to specialize. Goins acknowledges the influence of Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Ludwig Holbein. And Goins is still going. I saw some work of his reproduced in a magazine just 5 or 6 years ago. Rather than specializing, Goins has shown what can happen when a single individual takes complete control over their work. Goins bought his own printing business in 1971 and opened the St. Hermanius Press, where he both designs, illustrates, and letters posters, and then makes the negatives and plates and prints those very posters. His posters serve an immediate communication function, but they also are collected and hung for room decor. All of Goins' type is hand-lettered. He has a highly personal style with very symmetrical compositions, simplified line drawings, flat color, and his trademark is the pale color rimming of the contours of the images and letter forms. This is a poster for the screening of a Buster Keaton silent movie, 1973. It's an interesting, atypical approach. Goins has also written and published books at his press. One book relating to his initial interest in the graphic arts on the subject of calligraphy. Jumping across the Atlantic, beginning in the 1960s and continuing right up through the 90s, a European approach to graphic design was based on the manipulation of photographic images. Using collage and montage and other photomechanical means, producing a body of work known as European visual poetry. European visual poetry. These used photography instead of illustration to communicate a conceptual message. That is what it means, what you think about when you see it, together with the perceived content, what it looks like. One of the earliest of these visual poets is Günter Kaiser, who consistently found ways to solve the communication problem with very unexpected imagery. This is for a play called The Incapacitated Man. It's 1981. It was a radio play. Another German practitioner of this visual poetry is the Frankfurt-based designer Günter Rambo. Günter Rambo often worked together with two others. And again, Rambo used manipulation of photographic images through collage and montage. They defined the design process as the invention of unexpected images to solve communication problems. Their photographs are manipulated, massaged, montaged, or airbrushed to convert the ordinary into the extraordinary. This is number 3 out of a series of 11 that they did for the same client, a Frankfurt book publisher. They're very straightforward and documentary, black and white. They carried no verbal information except the logo and the client's name. These are from 1976. Here's a poster for a play by Günter Rambo, 1980. And another by Rambo, 1978, a play, Antigone. That burning chair photographed from that low vantage point is very stark. And again by Rambo, a poster for Othello in 1978. An image within an image. Here's a couple slides of 3 young designers in France two of whom trained with Henryk Tomaszewski, the Polish poster designer that we started our lecture with this evening. These three young designers in France had an anti-establishment bent and joined forces to turn their graphic design abilities into making political and social issues rather than typical commercial needs. They formed a Grappus studio, Grapus, in 1970. They are also identified with the European visual poets. They certainly were conceptual, but they went back to illustration instead of photography. This is a poster for an exhibition of their own work, combining Mickey Mouse ears with Hitler hair and mustache, a smile face, and both communist and French symbols. 1982. Grappus often used handwritten headlines, which were also popular in Poland. Gives their work kind of a street-like vitality and a graffiti-like approach. In third world countries, the poster has been an important vehicle for disseminating social and political ideas. Access to broadcast media and newspapers in third world countries is often limited, making the poster very effective. The Cuban Revolution promoted the applied arts for the use of the Castro government, ignoring the fine arts. The fine arts don't have the capacity to influence large numbers of people with revolutionary messages. An important leader of the Cuban graphic design was Raul Martinez. Martinez was a painter who created illustrative designs in a comic book style with these bright, intense colors. So this is celebrating the Cuban people in 1970. This is a 1967 poster celebrating an evening in 1953 when the ill-fated assault was launched by the Cuban Revolution. Cuba even became an exporter of propaganda materials throughout the Third World. This is the Organization for Solidarity with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or OSPAL, a Cuban organization devoted to that very purpose. It included verbiage in English, French, Spanish, and notably Arabic on each of the posters, along with elemental symbolic images. In case you can't read any of those languages, the high contrast image of Che Guevara, the martyred Cuban revolutionary, has become a symbol for liberation and struggles everywhere. In this case, the symbol morphs into a map of South America. Cuban graphic designers have adapted the graphic styles of Eastern European nations, particularly Poland, in their efforts. And we'll end it there. Thank you. Victor Moscasco's Blues Project poster in 1967 is just as illegible today as it was then, but he became a defining practitioner in this distinctly American design genre of psychedelic posters. He did most of the work for which he's famous in just a single year, 1967, mostly rejecting publicity photos of the band in favor of found imagery, hand-lettering the concert information out of the negative space around the nude vintage photo, adapting these Victorian wood typefaces. He then shows colors which would intentionally vibrate with each other. He was influenced by his formal education at the Cooper Union by important designers and instructors like Joseph Albers, the Bauhaus color theorist. But he consciously rejected all the rules he learned when he was a student. The rule that a poster should transmit a message simply and quickly became, how long can you engage the viewer in reading the poster? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes? And then don't use vibrating colors became irritate the eye as much as you can. He called it a rolled upside down. In a firm named Pushpin Studio. They were together for over 20 years and provided much of the artistic direction for the firm. They both met as students at the Cooper Union, a private art school in Manhattan, New York, where, I might add, as a proud parent, my son graduated from in art.